Welcome back, students. We are still on the consideration of Waec past question for biology for the year 2012. My name is still Lillian and this is still Insta School. Before we begin, I would like you to follow us on our social media handle if you have not done so at instaschool_edu on Instagram and on Facebook, and on Twitter at instaschool_live. Now let's move on to the consideration of question 31 to question 60. Now we have our question 31 as the excess carbohydrates can be stored in the muscles in the form of dash. Now we may already know that when we consume food that are rich in carbohydrates, when they are taken into our body, they are broken down into glucose. We can then use this glucose for energy and to also generate body heat. But usually we do not use all the glucose. Most of the glucose, the unused ones, are stored in the liver as glycogen. These glycogen are stored glucose. Later, when the body needs them, they are then converted back to glucose in order to be used by the body. So our answer there is option B, glycogen. Now moving on to our question 32. The bones of the legs of a 6-year-old boy are observed to be weak and crooked. Which of the following elements were deficient in his mother's diet at pregnancy? Now, weakness of the bone is also known as rickets, and it affects children. Not only children, but also adults. But in adults, it is known as osteoporosis. This weakness of the bone causes pain in the bone as a result of the softness of the bone. And what causes this weakness of the bone? It is caused by a deficiency in vitamin D. This vitamin D is what helps an individual to absorb calcium and phosphorus from food. So we can rightly say that the mother's diet at pregnancy, that is, the mother of the boy whose bones are weak, the mother's diet was deficient of calcium and phosphorus. This is what led to the weakness of the boy's bone. Our question 33. The diagram above is an illustration of an experimental setup to test the action of yeast. What test would be used to confirm the nature of the gas given off? Yeast can be tested in the laboratory. And how do we do this? We do it by adding simple sugar, that is glucose, to the yeast in a beaker or in a container. Afterwards, a cotton wool is placed on the top of the flask in order for the gas not to escape. Then the glucose and the yeast is left to ferment. The gas that is given off from this mixture is then added to another tube and mixed with lime water. Now, to show for the presence of CO2 gas, that is carbon dioxide gas, this lime water turns milky or cloudy white, and this shows the presence of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is a byproduct of the fermentation of yeast. So our answer is B. We pass the gas through lime water. This gas is CO2 gas. We move on to our question 34. Which of the following digestive enzymes would be greatly affected if the liver fails to produce bile. The bile that is produced by the liver helps to emulsify fats. What we mean by emulsification is breaking down fat into tiny droplets. It is only when the bile breaks down the fat into tiny droplets can the lipase enzyme access it and then further breaks it into fatty acid to be used by the body. So as you can see, if the liver should fail to produce bile, the enzyme lipase is affected because it will not be able to access fat that will be broken down and absorbed in the intestine. So our answer is our option C, lipase. Lipase will be greatly affected if the liver fails to produce bile. We move on to question 35. The appropriate food to be given to the child in the picture is dash. Well, if you can see the diagram, it shows a child with a protruding tummy and a swollen head. This child is suffering from a sickness known as kwashiorkor. Kwashiorkor is a condition that results from deficiency or inadequate protein in the diet. So we conclude that this child has kwashiorkor because one of the symptoms or characteristics of people that suffer from kwashiorkor is large and big belly in children. Other characteristics or symptoms can include growth failure, fatigue, and a damaged immune system. So for this child that is suffering from kwashiorkor, what do you think he needs? Do you think he needs garri or bread? No, he does not need any of these two foods. He requires a food that is rich in protein, like beans. And we have beans in our option A. This child should be given beans because he lacks protein, and beans is an excellent source of protein. We move on to question 36. Which of the following food substances will have little or no calorific value? Usually when we eat, the food substance benefits us, and this is due to the calorific value or the energy that we can get from them. The food with the highest calorific value is fat. We can also call them lipids. And this is because fat provides us with enough energy and heat for insulation in our body. The next in line is carbohydrates. Carbohydrate is the second highest food in calorific value. Then we have protein. So the odd one out of our option is water. Water does not provide us with any energy. It only refreshes us and helps to regulate our body temperature. So our answer is water. Water has no calorific value at all. So we move on to question 37. A space containing a group of interactive organisms is called dash. Now let's take a look at our option. When we talk of population, population refers to members of the same species, that is, different members of the same species that live together in a particular area. Now, what of habitat? Habitat refers to a place or an area that is being occupied by a community. So what is a community? Community is when different populations come together to live. They form a community. Community also refers to the interaction of different species or different population of species inhabiting a particular habitat at a point in time. Lastly, ecosystem. Ecosystem consists of all communities, that is, all the environmental factors in a place, including the living and the non-living things. So when we go back to our question, group of interactive organisms is called a community. So it is made up of different populations of species. We now move on to our question 38. The area around the Earth where life activities go on is referred to as dash. The Earth has different layers. We have the atmosphere. The atmosphere is the area of the Earth that is occupied by air. That is the atmospheric layer. Now, what about the lithosphere? The lithosphere is the rocky or the solid part of the Earth, while the biosphere is the area of Earth where living things exist. The biosphere is made up of all the ecosystem on Earth. So we can simply say that the biosphere is the area of the Earth, area around the Earth, where life activities go on. So our answer is our option A. We move on now to question 39. The following are abiotic components of the ecosystem except, when we talk of abiotic components, it is the opposite of biotic components. And the abiotic components refer to the non-living part of an ecosystem. First, let's give examples of the biotic components. The biotic component is majorly the plants, the animals, and the microorganisms present in the ecosystem. Now, what are examples of microorganisms? We have fungi and we have bacteria. On the other hand, the abiotic components are the non-living components such as the wind, the temperature, and water. We also have other examples. Non-living components of the environment that do not have the characteristics of living things. So among our options, which of them is not an abiotic component of the ecosystem? It is the bacteria, because bacteria is part of the biotic component of the environment, of the ecosystem. So we now move on to question 40. Which of the following instruments will be most appropriate in comparing the air pressure at different places in a habitat? When we want to get the atmospheric pressure or the air pressure in an area, we use an instrument known as the barometer. This barometer also helps to predict the weather condition of a particular habitat. So our answer is our option B, which is the barometer. We now move on to question 41. The best title for the above diagram is dash. So what do you see from this diagram? This diagram shows a food web. And from the organisms that are in this diagram, we have hawk, we have lion, we have goat, we have grass, and so on. These organisms are terrestrial organisms, that is, they live on land. So we can simply say that this diagram shows a terrestrial food web. And why do we say it is a food web? Because it comprises of different food chains. So our answer is our option A. It is a terrestrial food web. We move on to the next question. Using that same diagram, we are meant to answer this question. How many food chains are in the diagram? From this diagram, we have about 5 food chains. And we know that a food chain has and autotrophic and heterotrophic organisms, that is, the producers and the consumers. Usually, these consumers are the herbivores, the carnivores, and the omnivores. So this time, the grass is the autotrophic part of each of the food chain. So our answer is our option C. It is made up of 5 food chains. We now move on to question 43. Plants with breathing roots are characteristic features of vegetation in dash. Breathing roots are a type of specialized roots, and they function in helping plants take up oxygen. Now, in what ecosystem does the soil lack oxygen? Well, the mangrove. Due to the clay soil that are found in marshy areas, the plants need breathing roots in order to be able to take up enough oxygen. Now, the mangrove, an example of the mangrove is the saltwater environment. This saltwater environment, we find halophytes or salt-loving plants there, and they require these roots in order to take in oxygen. So saltwater swamp is our answer. We find plants that have breathing roots in saltwater swamps. We move on to question 44. In which of the zones from the diagram, in which of the zones can very few organisms be found? This diagram shows an aquatic ecosystem. And in this aquatic ecosystem, we can find both plants and animals in each of the zones. But one of these zones houses only very few of these organisms, both plants and animals. It is known as the benthic zone. The benthic zone is the darkest zone, and we have it as our part label 4 from here to here. The benthic zone houses a few organisms that are known as benthos. Now, what are some of the organisms we find in the benthic zone? We find sponges, sea urchins, and a few species of algae. So from our diagram, our answer is our option D, which is part labeled 4. So question 45. Which of the following factors exert a major effect on the distribution of living organisms in this habitat? One of the major limiting factors in the benthic zone of aquatic ecosystem is light, because the benthic zone can only receive a small amount of sunlight, and also there is low temperature and high pressure in this zone. So the few plant species that are found in the benthic zone have to make do with the very few sunlight that they can receive in order to carry out photosynthesis. So one of the major factors that affect organisms that are living in this zone is light. We now move on to question 46. The use of water closets and septic tanks is preferred to the use of buckets and pit latrines because why do most people in the urban area choose to use water closets and septic tank? It is usually preferred over the bucket and the pit latrine that is used in the villages and in the rural area. And this is because they are able to hold wastewater like the septic tank. It is buried into the ground. It can hold enough wastewater and allow the solid part to settle to the ground. It is also cost-effective and durable. And importantly, it does not cause pollution to the environment. Now, what about the water closet that is present in most of our toilets in the city? These water closets are able to move down the wastewater into the ground due to the water system. And by doing this, flies are not able to perch on feces. So when we look at our option, it is most preferred not just because it is cost effective, but also contaminated feces are completely kept away from the flies, because flies cannot perch on contaminated feces in the septic tank and the water closet present in the urban area. So our answer is our option B. We now move on to question 47. The detection of Vibrio cholera in public drinking water is a sign of dash. Vibrio cholera is a bacteria. It can cause cholera. This bacteria is usually found in dirty and contaminated food and water, but especially in water, dirty and contaminated water. Cholera can infect the intestine, and when somebody is diagnosed with cholera, it can lead to watery diarrhea, vomiting, and so on. So for this bacteria, Vibrio cholerae, to be detected in a public drinking water, it shows that the water is polluted and contaminated. So our option is option C. It shows water pollution. We move on to question 48. Which of the following factors would be least likely to act as a density-dependent limiting factor in a population of mice? Now, when we talk about limiting factor, in this case, in a population of mice, we're referring to those things that can lead to a decrease in the population of mice, such as unfavorable environmental condition, unavailability of food and water, and shelter and space. Other limiting factors can also be predation, diseases, and competition for the limited resources. One of the least likely factors that will cause a decrease in the population of mice is parasitism. That is the odd one out of our answer. So that's our option C as the answer. We now move on to question 49. The primary cause of species endangerment is dash. When we talk of species endangerment, we are referring to organisms that are on the brink of extinction. Species endangerment is usually caused due to the destruction of the habitat of these species. What we mean is, what we're talking about is when organisms do not have a place to live due to the fact that their habitat or where they live has been destroyed, they find it hard to adapt into other habitats, or they find no habitat at all to live in. And this can lead to their going into extinction. Other factors that can cause species endangerment is pollution, diseases, and degradation. So among our options, the one that best suits our answer is option A, disappearing habitats, usually due to human activities. We move on now to question 50. Question 50 says, the following pairs of traits are examples of continuous and discontinuous variation respectively, except dash. Now, when we talk of continuous variation, this is the variation or the differences present in the genes or in the genetic information of an individual. Usually, these variations are controlled by many genes. Some examples are height, weight, and heart rate. But when we talk of discontinuous variation, this is the observable difference, that is, the phenotypic difference in individuals. These differences are usually controlled by one or two genes, such as our eye color, fingerprints, ability to roll tongue, and blood group. So let's now go back to our question. Respectively, height is an example of continuous variation. Blood group is an example of discontinuous variation. Now, what about skin color? Skin color is an example of is an example of discontinuous variation, while skin color is an example of continuous variation. Now, the only odd one out of this our option is our option A, because eye color is an example of discontinuous variation, while the body weight is an example of continuous variation. And the question is telling us that each of these are arranged respectively, that is, continuous variation on the right and discontinuous variation on the left, except one, which is our option A, because eye color is an example of discontinuous variation, while body weight is an example of continuous variation. We now move on to the next question. Our question 51. Which of the following statements is true about the ABO blood group system? In the ABO blood group system, the classification of the human blood is usually determined by either the presence or the absence of antigen A, antigen B, or both antigen A and B. These antigens are located on the surface of the red blood cells, while the antibodies are located on the plasma. So we're looking for the one that is true. As I've said earlier, the antigens are located on the red blood cells and not the white blood cell. So option A is wrong. Now, what of option B? Antibodies are located in the blood plasma. This is correct. In the ABO blood group system, the antibodies are usually located in the plasma of our blood. So we move on to our question 52. The classes of fingerprints in man are dash. Now, you must have heard that no two humans has the same fingerprints, even identical twin. So each of us has a unique fingerprint. But then we can classify these fingerprints due to their pattern. We have the loop, we have the wall, and we have the arches. So which of our option contains these three fingerprints? Our option C, we have wall, arc, and loop, and also compound. So we now move on to the next question, question 53. Which of the following disease is transmittable through gene? Now, when we look at our option A, HIV/AIDS, is it transmitted through the genes? Usually, the human immunodeficiency virus is a disease, a virus that affects the immune system, but it does not affect the gene, an individual gene. But when we look at our option B, sickle cell anemia, sickle cell anemia is a disease that can be transmitted through the gene. Usually, an individual gets the sickle cell anemia when either of his both parents has this as a recessive or as a dominant trait. For example, if an AS man should marry an AS woman, they will have an SS offspring, that is, an offspring that is a sufferer of the sickle cell anemia. So our option B is very correct. Sickle cell anemia is transmittable through the genes. So we now move on to question 54. Two plants with red flowers were backcrossed. Which of the following results indicates that the plants are heterozygous red flowers, where red flowers are dominant? Now we see that red flowers are dominant over white flowers. And since they are heterozygous, what percentage do you think red flowers will have? Red flowers being paired with white flowers would have 75%. And we say so because they cannot have 50% alongside white flowers because they are dominant and they are heterozygous. So we leave the remaining 25% for the white flowers. So that's our option A. 75% goes to the red flowers, while 25% goes to the white flowers. Question 55. In the structure of DNA, which of the following statements is true? Now, in the structure of the DNA, we have a double helix structure. This structure is held together by hydrogen bond. Now, what of the nucleotide? The nucleotide is composed of a nitrogen-containing bond, a sugar molecule, and a phosphate group. Now, what about the pairing, the base pairing? Usually, guanine is a complementary of cytosine. This is because guanine is purine and it pairs up with cytosine, which is a pyrimidine. Lastly, adenine. Adenine is a complementary of thymine because usually as guanine is pairing to cytosine, adenine is pairing to thymine because adenine is a purine while thymine is a pyrimidine. So which of these options is correct? As I've said earlier, the double helix bonds are held together by hydrogen bond and not covalent bond. And the nucleotide is made up of a nitrogen-containing bond, a sugar molecule, and a phosphate group. So option B is wrong. Option D is also wrong. The most correct answer is the option C. The guanine, which is a purine, pairs, that is, it is a complementary of cytosine, which is a pyrimidine. Let us now move on to our question 56. In a case of complete dominance, what is the phenotypic ratio of the cross BB, that is heterozygous B and another heterozygous B, where capital B is black and small b is white? Well, when we cross these two, the genetic ratio, that is the genotypic ratio between them will be 1 homozygous black, 2 heterozygous black, and 1 recessive white. But our question says we should look for the phenotypic ratio, that is the observable, the physical appearance. And our answer would therefore be 3 blacks and 1 white. Even though in their genes we have 1 homozygous black, 2 heterozygous black, and 1 recessive white. But the phenotypic ratio, that is the observable difference or the observable appearance, will be 3 blacks and 1 white. That's our option D. Question 57. 2 yellow flowered hybrid plants, each carrying a recessive factor for flowers with green color, were crossed. Which of the following ratios show the correct proportion of offspring that have green plants? Now, if we cross these 2 plants, that is, we can say since it is yellow, we can represent it by Y, capital Y. Then the green color is recessive, we can represent it by small g. If we cross these 2, we have 1 homozygous yellow, 2 heterozygous yellow, and 1 complete green flower. So in the F1 generation, we have 1 green flower out of the 4 offspring. So our correct answer is option C, 1 in 4. We now move on to question 58. What name is given to a sudden change in a gene or chromosome? When we talk about a change or an alteration in a gene or in a chromosome, which is usually caused by a mistake in the DNA sequence, we are talking about mutation. Mutation can also be caused by environmental factor, which has effect on the DNA. Some example of mutation of gene results in Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, and color blindness. So mutation is our most correct answer. Mutation is when there is a change in the gene or in the chromosome due to a mistake in the DNA synthesis or even environmental factors. We now move on to question 59. Bees are of great importance to the farmer because they dash. Well, we know that bees produce honey and they are of economic importance. They are also of health benefits. But a farmer benefits more from a bee due to the fact that this bee has the ability to pollinate. That is, bee is a pollinator. It transfers pollen grain from one flower to another of the same species. Usually, the bee is attracted to the colorful petals of a flower. They can suck the nectar and even transfer some of it to another flower in order for fertilization to take place. So, of all options, option B is the most correct because bees help to pollinate flowers, and this is why they are of great importance to farmers. We move to the last question, question 60. Which of the following sequences is the correct evolutionary trend in plants? In the evolutionary trends in plants, that is, from the lowest to the highest classification of plants, the algae are the most ancient, that is, the green algae were the first to come on land. Then we move on to the liverworts and then on to the mosses before we now get to the ferns. The ferns are the most advanced. When we talk of ferns, we're talking about seed plants, that is, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The algae are the most ancient. So we can settle for our option A. Thank you so much for joining us till the end of today's session. I hope to see you next time. But before then, I would like you to follow us on our social media handle at instaschool_edu and at instaschool_live. My name is still Lillian, and I'll see you next time.